Now, to complicate matters further, IBD is really a combination of many different things. And each person who has IBD probably has a different mix of these things. We now say that someone who has inflammatory bowel disease has a genetic susceptibility to having a dysregulated or unregulated immune response from something in their environment that affects the microbes in their bowel. So just saying that one sentence, you can figure out why this is so complicated. Something in the environment affects the microbes in your gut that affects your immune system, which doesn't have the ability to regulate. And all of this is based on some of your genetic susceptibility. So pick one of these, and we can talk about why this is so complicated. I only have 1 or 2 slides on each one of those factors just to show you what this is. So this is Dr. Kersner. Some in the room may have heard of him or know him. Dr. Kersner started studying inflammatory bowel disease at the University of Chicago in 1935, which is, he says, when our Inflammatory Bowel Disease Center started. Dr. Kersner lived to be 102. He died in 2012, and he was still completely aware and with it up until the end, still talking about how we're going to find a cure for IBD. And he did a lot of interesting things in his life, and one of them was that he described familial inflammatory bowel disease, families that had a pedigree, that's what that is on the right there, where multiple people had the disease. And so he said in the early days, all the way in the 1960s, he said, there's got to be genetics that are driving some of this. And in fact, all the way in 2001, at the University of Chicago, they found the first gene for Crohn's disease. It was a major discovery. It happened at the University of Chicago, and there were some groups in France and at the University of Michigan who all stumbled on this at the same time. So they found this one gene for Crohn's disease, and a lot of the patients who were seen at the University of Chicago were part of that discovery. And people wrote papers like, a cure can't be far off. We found the gene for Crohn's. Well, some of you in the room know that since then, they've found 199 other genes for Crohn's and colitis. This is just some of them. And so as soon as you start hearing that, you must recognize that this is not a purely genetic disease. In fact, now when they study these different genetic conditions, they find that some of the genes for Crohn's and colitis exist in all these other conditions here in blue. So some of the other immune conditions like asthma or even type 2 diabetes, celiac disease, there's overlap of some of these genes into these other problems. And very interestingly, there's also some of these genes that are found in people who are susceptible to some infections, getting back to the thought that maybe IBD is just an infection. So we now have almost 200 genetic variants associated with Crohn's and colitis, and between 1/3 and 1/2 of them exist in both conditions. So again, getting to this whole confusing picture of many different types of diseases that together make up IBD. And the other part of this is that it's complicated. So some people who have the same genes will not get IBD as others. And some people who have the same disease will have completely different genes. And so this is called a complex genetic disorder. It means that some people have a very high genetic susceptibility, which is the green curve there. That means that at an early age, it takes very little to trigger the disease onset. So anyone here who was diagnosed as a child might be more on the susceptibility of a high genetic component. And some people get it much later. So the purple line there are people who need a lot of environment exposure before they finally get IBD. And a classic group of those patients are people who develop ulcerative colitis after they quit smoking cigarettes. Quitting smoking triggers ulcerative colitis. And when that happens, that can be a difficult disease to treat. That doesn't mean you should be smoking, everybody. Don't misinterpret. So you got the Crohn's disease in a 4-year-old, high genetic susceptibility, the ulcerative colitis in an ex-smoker, low genetic susceptibility, much more environment. And the question I have for all the people in the room is, where do you think you are on the curve? Are you more genetic? Is this something where you had lots of family members? Or are you more environmental? You feel like this came on later in life and you must have been exposed to something that triggered it. And in fact, there's been lots of environmental risk factors. So as complicated as the genes are, look at all the environmental things that have been associated. Exposure to anti-inflammatory drugs, having oral contraceptives on board, having a sibling with IBD, smoking cigarettes increases your risk for Crohn's. Decreasing risk, living in a sunny area of the country maybe, eating more dietary fiber, is that really a decreased risk, or is that an observation because people who can eat fiber don't have IBD? We don't know. That's the complicated part of looking at environment. So don't read too much into this. Just know that when we study these things, it's very complicated to figure out. There was a study once that said that it was the development of refrigeration in the United Kingdom that led to the rise of Crohn's disease in the UK. On the other hand, lots of other things happened when refrigeration was developed.